Hey, this is Davin with Hagerty and our Redline Rebuild updates, and today we're going to assemble this engine. Beautiful. Here we go. So this is why you measure stuff. That ain't gonna work. Hey, if you like what you're watching, do me a favor. Go check out the Hagerty Drivers Club. 24/7 roadside assistance with flatbed towing, subscription to our award-winning magazine, and more. Sign up today. Links right down here in the description. So at this point, things are looking absolutely gorgeous. Thanks to Vern over at Hammer and Dolly Auto Restorations. He laid down the paint on all the parts, all the blue that you see. And then after we got it back over here, I went through and painted into the intake valley, or the lifter valley. So what this is Gliptol. It seals off all the pores in that cast iron area, and it helps for the oil flow to go back down into the pan. I'm gonna go through and chase all the threads, and specifically like your head bolts, you wanna make sure that that thread is nice and clean, so then when you torque your bolt or you put your stud down in there, that it doesn't bind up. Now, there's a couple ways we can actuate, if you will, or turn this tap in. You could also use a thread chaser as well. And the idea here is you're only going through, cleaning up the threads, taking out whatever particles may be in there that didn't come out in the cleaning process, or if you got a little bit of rust in there after you did wash everything out and didn't get all the water out, you'll get a little residue. Well, we have everything cleaned out, all the dust, everything blown back off of this, and kind of wiped down again. So at this point, I'm going to go through and put the freeze plugs in. So yes, they're also core plugs, but we call them freeze plugs here where I live. Going to install those. They're brass. They go in the sides. I'm going to put a little of this Permatex sealer around the outside edges and then hammer them in. Just like that. Fill in, it's done. Our next step is to put the cam bearings in and the cam plug. Now, you can put in 3 back here because the way the cam driver works, it lines up off of the end of the block and then you knock them in. Now, unfortunately, our engine stand is in the way when we go this direction. So I need to pull the block back off the engine stand, set it up on the table using the engine hoist, and hammer those in. Oh, yeah. That's what I'm talking about. All right, so now our next order of operation here is to get our main bearings in and our crank installed. And of course, all the main caps torqued down. But first, I need to go through and verify all my oil clearances. So here's my initial measurements. I went through and took the crankshaft out, had it cut. But it's always a good idea to verify that, well, A, I give them the right numbers, and B, he cut them to the right size. Not real concerned that there'll be a problem, but now's the time to find it if there is a difference. So to measure your clearance, you're gonna have your bearing in, and you're measuring the ID of the cap function to the OD of your crankshaft. The difference is the clearance. And in our case, we're looking for 1.5 to 2 thousandths oil clearance on the rods and mains, and we'll see where it stacks out. So just like when you install them permanently, you want to increment your torque value. So basically divide your overall torque in half, I should say into thirds, and then go from there. So in other words, this is going to be at 100 foot-pounds on my mains, the center bolts, and so I'll torque them at 50, 75, and then 100 for the final torque. Right where we wanted it. Sweet. We have our main caps torqued in. We measured all of them. We're comparing that to the crankshaft, and we're at 1.5 all the way through, 100% as planned. I love it when a plan comes together. All right, let's get the caps out of the way. Okay, so just like I did on the mains, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the rods. These happen to already be torqued down, so I'll measure the ID of the rod and measure the OD on the journal of the crankshaft. Take the difference, that's my oil clearance. All right, with any remaining seal, or at least all of them that I've come across so far, you always want to, I'll say clock, or at least offset the seal ends. In other words, you don't want this end to be flush with the cap. So I usually put them about, right around 1/4 inch. That way all the lines don't line up, less likely to leak. Any of the caps here, you don't want to use the bolts to bring them into the index. You want to give them just a little tap to set them, right like that. Because otherwise, when you pull the bolts down, you might crack the cap, and that would make a bad day. Now, normally, I would take and put one cap on at a time, torque it down, make sure it turns, keep moving along. Now, ARP recommends, in this particular case, they took the time and effort to put together a bolt sequence, so well, I might as well follow along as well. There we go. Crankshaft is in. Beautiful. Okay, we are on to installing our pistons. But now before we do that, we need to go through and verify that our ring gap will be correct inside the bore. So basically that is when they're installed, how much gap is there. And if there's too much, we don't want them to overlap and hit when they get hot. Take your piston ring, set it in the bore, use something that will give it, put it at the exact same height all the way around so it's square. Otherwise your gap won't be correct. And then come in and measure it. Now you can see this gap is pretty tight. Right now we're at, it's about 3 thousandths. That will be a big problem because our gap should be 16 thousandths on the top ring and 20 thousandths on the bottom ring. How do I know that? Pretty simple formula. It's 4 thousandths times your bore diameter for the top ring and 5 thousandths to the bore diameter for the bottom ring. Pretty simple. And why, you ask? Is the top ring tighter than the bottom ring? Top ring has all the compression, so they want to hold that in there. You want less leak by that area, and that gives you plenty of growth as far as the ring is concerned, and not close up and be too tight. So from there, we're going to start wheeling and dealing here on our ring filer, and then we can assemble all the pistons. On my first ring, obviously you don't want to go too far and have that gap too big. So what I do, put some pressure against it, and I count my number of revolutions, and then I'll measure it and say, oh, look at that, I took 1 thousandths off. Let's hope it's a whole lot more than that based on the fact that we got to go 13 thousandths. But here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Now before I put this in there, you don't want to put a burr scraping your cylinder wall. So you need to put a chamfer, especially on the side you just filed. Now for those of you that have not invested in a ring filer and you filed rings this way, friend of mine, you know who you are. Buy one, they're cheap. Trust me, it'll save you so much time, it's crazy. So our 20 cranks got us, we're at 8,000 so far. Got us 9 thousandths gap, so that 20 cranks was 6 thousandths. Just gives you an idea. Don't just jump into it and, you know, go all out, but at least it gives you some idea of how many cranks you're going to need. So for every 10, you're going to get about 3 thousandths worth of gap added.
One eternity later.
Now that our rings are filed, we could move on to assembling the rings onto the piston. But I want to step back just a little bit and remember the number I told you, the ring gap, the gap is a minimum. So a little bit bigger is fine, don't go smaller. All right, so ring assembly is pretty simple. You're going to just take the ring, use a pair of ring spreaders, or you can use your fingers. The biggest thing is don't overspread them, only make them as big as you have to. You don't want to crack them. Slip them down onto the ring glands, and of course you're going to work from the bottom to the top. This dot goes up. I like them when they have dots. I don't have to think about anything else. There we go. Number one's ready. Boom. With our piston assemblies ready to go into the engine assembly, I'm going to put some assembly lube on all the rod journals. And yeah, I'm just using my finger because it's quite, honestly, it's quicker than the brush today. So get these lubed up real nice and then start putting pistons down the holes.
Again, the hand is the tool of choice here?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so my hand is once again the best tool to use going into these bores. What I'm trying to do is basically coat all the surface of the cylinder bore. That way when I run the piston down in there, I have no dry spot, especially during startup. And helps the rings and everything be happy. Yay! And I will increment them up as well. I usually do the rods more by feel, but as far as the increment. Okay, there's number one. All the pistons are in, and it should move nice and free. It does. Not that I'm surprised. Excellent. Very nice. Well, you can see I had my timing chain on, and for those of you that are keeping score, you'll notice that I do not have my eccentric on here for my fuel pump. Now, the reason I don't have that on there is if I need to pull this back and forth, there's no reason to fumble around with this. I can pull this bolt out anyway real quick and throw the eccentric on. But why I may need to pull this timing gear and everything back out, I have everything lined up. It's at 0 and it's at 0, so it's assembled correctly. However, what you want to do is go through and verify that the camshaft is assembled at the, or degreed, as they say, to 110 on the lobe separation of the intake. Now, what is that? Did the cam manufacturer mess up if it's wrong? Well, no. Cam manufacturer did their job, but he can't account for all the other components that go into the variability of that position. So, you know, basically your chain, your gear, the crankshaft, the keyway, all that all stacks up into where this opens and closes. So real quickly, you go through, you use a degree wheel, you use a dial indicator on your lobe and a top dead center, and all those parts, or I should say all those tools, get you to that number. Now, here's how you do it. So first thing, I need to determine exactly where top dead center is of my piston. Now, as it goes through a stroke, right, you can go up and you can stop it, but that doesn't mean it's at 0 degrees of the crankshaft. So you need to find that position. Got my degree wheel on. Now I need to put my top dead center gauge on over the top of my piston. Now it's going to zero out on the block, on the deck of the block, and of course it has a post that comes down into touch the piston. I certainly don't want to leave my piston way up high and then crank this down, put a hole in my piston or dimple it. So what I'm going to do now is rotate the crankshaft clockwise, putting it down into the hole some, okay? That allows me to put my gauge on, or I should say my stop. Come counterclockwise up to it. Now zero out your dial indicator. I should say zero out your degree wheel. If I bring this to 0, my math is a whole lot easier here, and you'll see here in a second. All right, so that's 0. Now rotate your crankshaft clockwise all the way around until it touches the stop again. This keeps everything tight, going the same direction as the motor rotation. Bump the stop. Now read your number and divide it in half. So that I would call that 47 and a half, 23 3/4. Take your stop off. Rotate your crankshaft until the degree wheel reads 23 3/4. And yes, the 3/4 is going to be a little bit of an estimate. So there's 24, right about there. Should be a little bit before. How's that look? So you have 23 3/4, that's my 0 point. Now, that doesn't really matter anymore because what I'm going to do, now I'm going to rotate the degree wheel so it reads exactly on 0. That way I don't have to make some weird compensation for 23 degrees. Now I'm ready to put my gauge in for my lifter. And when you set this in, you want your camshaft to be on the base circle. Right now it's a little bit back, so I'm going to back it up. If you're not sure which one of these is your intake lobe on number 1, look at the cylinder heads. Ask me how I know. Take our gauge, set it in there. Make sure it's preloaded a little bit onto our lifter. Okay. Now with that, I need to come over here, rotate the crankshaft clockwise. Are you looking for the max lift, or determining where max lift is at of the camshaft on the intake? Oh, and the needle reverses. That's my max. I don't think it reversed already. Okay, right there's max. Zero this out. Now I'll go counterclockwise to, say, 100 thousandths. It doesn't really make a big difference. All you're really doing is you need to read the degrees at 50, but you need to take the slack back up into the chain so everything's meshed in the same direction. So come back. Again, it just has to be passed. Most people say 100. It's not super critical. Okay, so now I'm past, because 50 is way over here. I passed that point. Now I'll come back to it. Read your degree wheel. That says 62. Write that number down. Now go on the lobe, go clockwise on your crankshaft, so the lifter goes up and over the lobe to 50 thousandths there. I got a weird light there. I can't see it. Damn. That's 50. Okay, so there's 50 that way. Now come back over to our degree wheel. Read our number off of here. So that's 55. We're at 57. I'll call it 58. So 58, 158. Add that to the 62 and divide in half. So it's 0. 220 divided by 2 is 110. Comparing that to our cam card, and it's 110 is the number we're looking for. I won't lie to you, I've spent hours trying to get some of these to degree in correctly, and today it only took one shot, so that's not bad. It's a good day, and well, it's a good day. So we're at 110, exactly where the cam manufacturer wants it. That's what Schneider recommended, so that's where we have it. And at that point, take all the claptrap back off as far as the tools are concerned. Then I can put my cam eccentric back up on here. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Now I can take my cam bolt out and I can put the fuel pump eccentric underneath there, bolt everything up tight, and then this section of things are done. I can move on to the timing cover, and then of course the oil pan. And yes, this is a huge oil pan. We increased capacity, roughly from 6 on the stock standpoint to 9 quarts. Well, you obviously won't run a full 9 quarts, but we will not starve this baby for oil. All right, we're gonna leave this sit and get our cylinder heads assembled. But first, before I get too far into this, I need to verify that the springs I have, per the box, is actually what was in the box. So what my point is, yes, you bought parts, but it's your responsibility as engine builder to make sure the parts you're putting in the engine, well, are the right ones, even though they may or may not be in the box. Most of the time they are. So pretty simple. Got a spring tester on the box, and of course, relative to the camshaft are the specs for your spring. So here they are on these comp cam springs. So it needs to be installed height at 1 inch 900. It needs to be 153 pounds. So to measure that with the spring tester, you need to have your retainer, because if you don't have your retainer, you're not going to push the inner spring correctly, because you can see that there's a slight step. Now, at the same token, you need to understand what this thickness is, because you'll have to add that to your travel. So we're about 100 thousandths. So we're about 100 thousandths. So our installed height is 1 inch 900 plus the 100 of the retainer. So that's a full 2 inches. All right, so let's bring this down to exactly 2 inches. All right, so at 2 inches, or our installed height of 1 inch 900, we will have a seat load of 157. Spec is 153 based on the box, so that's well within a decent number. It's plus or minus 5 basically, so we're all good that way. If you have a spring that's too low, all you're gonna do is install it at a little bit shorter height, get a little more spring load. So I'll go through and check all these springs, make sure they're all in that ballpark, so I know what my installed height needs to be for each individual spring. And they're pretty consistent, but we do have 3 flyers in there. 2 that are not going to be installed quite so tight. We're going to take 15 thousandths out of them. I guess I should say they're going to be opened up a little bit. And then 1 that's dead on. So moving on. So here's how you measure spring height. First off, you have to have a micrometer specific to measuring the spring height. You can kind of see it looks like a spring, meaning it's going to go in here like this. And then we're going to put our retainer on and our 2 keepers and bring everything tight, and then whatever this reads is our installed height. Then we will take and adjust it with some shims. Obviously it's going to be a more difficult process if we need more space, but if we're trying to reduce space, these shims work perfect. Take your valve, put it in there, bring this down enough to put your keepers in, and you do want to use both keepers. This is where that 14th hand would work nice. Just bring this in. Here we go. So this is why you measure stuff. I have 1 inch, just a little bit over 850. You can call it 852. For friends, we're just going to call it 850. I told you I need 900. That's a problem by 50 thousandths, meaning I'm not up high enough here. We want to have 1 inch 900 as far as our installed height of our springs, and we were at, with the standard keeper, we're at 1 inch 850. So there are keepers that are available to move this installed up higher, and they happen to be 50 thousandths. So luckily that worked out very well. All right, so now we have 1 inch 900. Pretty simple installing valves and springs into the cylinder heads. Take your valve, put a little bit of oil on it, on the stem here. That way it's not going to be completely dry inside the guide. Slide that up into the hole like that. This would be the time that you would put your shim in, if you need that, but it is certainly the time to put your seal on. Now, this little clear sleeve, if you have them, is really nice because it goes over the top of this and then protects your seal from getting damaged on the end of the valve stems. Again, I like to put a little oil on those. It just makes everything go together the better. Okay, so pull the cover off and heck, put it right on the next valve. Now, before I put the springs on, what I like to do is I put a little bit of grease up on the top where the keepers are at. Then put this on here. That way, when I bring everything down, my keepers have something they stick to before I release the compressor. So here's the compressor. This is all adjustable to work with multiple things. Bring this in, and now you can see my valve stubs hanging out. Here's where the grease comes in. When you stick these on here, you can rotate them around. They stay put a little better, especially if they're up higher. Slowly release it. Boom. Done. Now multiply that times, well, add 7 more on this head, 8 more on the other. We're all set. Next step here will be to take these out of the wrapper, set them down on the head, and loosely mock up my cylinder heads on there with just a couple bolts, and then run through and check my clearance, valve to piston clearance. Now I know I went through and assembled these heads all together, and I have to take at least 2 of these springs off. Now, you're gonna say, well, that was stupid. Well, it is, only in the fact that I'm doing another, we're doing the time-lapse video and everything's gotta go together once. So yes, I have to walk backwards, take these springs out, and put in these setup springs. Now, what these are for is I can not worry about my lifters, my hydraulic lifters compressing with these heavy springs, right? Once there's oil pressure, the hydraulic lifters don't compress, but right now, if there is no oil pressure, they would compress. So to balance that out, you put a lighter spring in there. That way you can roll the motor over, actuate all the valve train. I will be able to check for my push rod height as well. And then I don't have to worry about getting a bad number or bending push rods for that matter. Head bolts right here. For our clearance, I like to use a little bit of putty in here. It's really easy. It doesn't cause any issues. It's just the modeling clay or putty. So the areas you worry about is where all the valves are hitting. On this head, you don't have to worry about. On a closed chamber, you would also want to measure down here because there's a big flat spot in the head, but we don't have that issue here because we're wide open. And here's that one. Okay, so those are in place. I kind of got my fingers underneath. There. So it's sitting on there. Now I don't have to get all excited about compressing that gasket right tight. I'm not gonna torque this down. I'm just gonna set it down tight. I'm gonna run some bolts in here to hold it just from lifting so it can at least stay there with the, the pressure of these springs. But being that these springs are so light, I don't have to get too excited about that. And I don't have to worry about ruining the head gasket for any particular reason. So we're just gonna run these down. And of course we have to have our guide plates and our studs on here. Again, we're mocking everything up with the valve train, and we're gonna also check our contact point on the top of the stem of the valves while we're pushing them over and checking the clearance to the piston. We're gonna kill two birds with one stone here and determine that. Now, why do I need different push rods? Well, here's the stock push rod that was in it. And mind you, I've changed camshaft. I've changed the completely different style of rocker, or completely different style of lifters. I've cut the bottom of the cylinder as far as decked the cylinders, and I've decked the block itself. So all those dimensions are changing. And of course, we have a completely different valve train set up here. Now, we want this, this is gonna need to, the rocker's gonna need to sit right about there. Now, a tape measure isn't sufficient for this. So we start off, we want something in there. So let's start off just to see what the stock push rod would look like. And that stock rod would look like that. And that is a very aggressive angle. That was actually where it would be at full stroke. So that length push rod is not going to be very good. So obviously we need a little bit shorter, and that's where these adjustables come in. The ends screw in and out, gives you a change in the length, and there's different center sections to work with as well. Now this actually is currently mocked up 9 to 10, which is the size of the stock rod. So I'm going to start with a little bit shorter one so we can figure this out. Oh, look at that. See? How nice it is. That's a pretty good guess. Just an eyeball in it. Typically speaking, when you're checking clearance, you want to be somewhere around 100 thousandths. Now, you can go a little tighter on the intake and a little looser on the exhaust. Remember, the exhaust is going to increase in temperature and grow. So you want a little more clearance on the exhaust side than you do the intake side. So you usually can pinch, intake around 80, and then I like to have it like 100 to 120 on my exhaust. Now, in our case, mainly because we're using open chamber heads, so what that means is they're huge. At the end of the day here, what I have on the intake is right around 400. I mean, it's clay, so you're gonna check at 390. So I have a lot of clearance on the intake. So in other words, no concern with kissing valves to the pistons. And then here you can see, obviously, on the exhaust, get this peeled up out of here. The trick is just to slide it. You don't distort it. Now, come in here. And now we do have a little bit of a wedge to this. So find the thinnest spot, and we're at 380. So what I'm getting at is we got plenty of clearance. So I had the push rod in there, and you can see here the witness mark where it was on the intake. It rubbed a little bit of the magic marker off, which is the whole idea. So I want to be in the center third, and that's in dead center is absolutely perfect, but you have to have some amount of wipe, right? Because it is rolling across there because it's on an arc, but you have, that's pretty good there. What I'll do is I'll look at my push rods. They come in 50 thousandths increments, and if anything, I would take a push rod that's just a little bit longer than where I currently have it adjusted at. And on the exhaust on this one, it didn't wipe off quite as easy or well, but it's pretty well the same spot, so just a little bit longer there. On these Ford heads, it takes the same push rod exhaust intake. Not every engine does. I know a Hemi is different. So let's get those measured. And I just measure tip to tip. Most manufacturers the push rods will fall in just fine that way. So like I was saying, this is 7/9/20. Now I could have them manufactured, custom cut exactly to 7/9/20 if I really need to, but like I said, I could go just a little bit longer and it would set a little more centered, so that'll be better for my application. And we'll go to the nearest 50 thousandths, so that'd be 7/9/50. So at this point, I just need to find some push rods that are 7/9/50 and get them coming our way. While I'm waiting for those, though, I still got work to do. So cylinder heads can go on, get torqued down, finalized, and continue moving on the assembly. All right, so setting valve lash is fairly straightforward, but there's a couple key things you need to know. So you rotate the crankshaft, and just as the exhaust starts to open, then you can set your intake valve. Now, as to do the exhaust, as the intake starts to fall, or basically it's went through its max lift and it's starting to go back down, that's when you set the exhaust. So on a mechanical, you would use a feeler gauge to set that lash gap. On a hydraulic, you are actually preloading the lifter slightly to be in that zone that the manufacturer asks for. So as I go to set this to find zero lash, I take my push rod and I'll take and spin this like this, and as I rotate my nut at top, I'll find where this basically has some tension, and that's zero. Now I'm going to take and rotate this a quarter turn. I like to do something horizontal to the inline, if you will, with the head. That gives me a reference point. So here's a quarter turn, and that would be a half a turn. I'm going to set all these at oddly about 3/8. That puts me in the center of the spec. And then once that's set, keep the same wrench on the outside to stop it from turning, and there's a set screw on these at the very center. Bring that down and then tighten it. Snug it and then tighten it. That one's done. So before I put the intake manifold on and button up the valve covers and all that, I like to prime the oil so I can see it. So oil's gonna come up through the push rods and then out through the tops of the rockers and then drip down these springs. So one of the things I really try not to do is drool oil all over the side of the motor. And in our case, we're gonna be using these risers or spacers on the valve covers. So I just temp those up. Gives me a little bit longer lip, and oil is less likely to well, go on the floor. Oil line is hooked up back here, temped up with our Easy Run test meters, so I can watch my oil pressure, and I guess the way we go, because one of my concerns, just because it's different than what I've done in the past, is putting the bushings in there, in the hole, and all that jazz. So let's move forward. Get her primed. And I always guess at which way to go, so. There it is. Oh, baby. We got pressure. Actually, it's coming. That one right there looks like it doesn't have any yet. All right, so we have oil coming to all of our rockers. One was a little slow. That doesn't surprise me any. Doesn't mean there's an issue. Just basically had to fill all the passages before it got pressure to push that up through there. So again, how the oiling system works on the valve train is oil comes down that journal that's with all the lifters. It feeds the lifters, pumps them up as well on a hydraulic, and then the oil comes up the pushrod tubes to the rockers. They come down the rocker at the same time. It'll lube your fulcrum point. In this case, it's a needle bearing, and then rolls down, lubricates the next roller at the tip of the valve stem, and at the same time runs oil. You can see it right here on this one, where oil runs down the spring. Now the key there is it also cools the spring slightly. So that is how this side of things work. Obviously with all the roller stuff in it, you don't need as much oil, and that's why we were able to restrict it. If we were all back on the, the factory side of things where it's a lot more rubbing and scraping, then you have more lubrication needed. So with that, we can move forward, put our intake manifold on, and get this button going. All right, so we're moving on to putting our headers on. Now, one word of advice on headers: don't use these long term. Well, you can, but you'll be replacing them because they don't hold up. Sorry for the guy that designed them, but a better job. So I'm gonna use these ultimately, in the car, I'm gonna use these Remflex. They're thicker, they do a lot better job, and they don't burn out. Now, you're gonna ask me this: why are you putting the headers on and then taking them off? It is absolutely impossible to put the headers with the motor into the car. So they're gonna come off. So long story short, I'm putting them on, using these, throwing these away when I take the headers off, and then putting these on when I go into the car. But I'm trying to circumvent all you guys that wanna comment about how crappy these are. I already know that, but put it in the comments anyway. Just like that, we went from the engine assembly room, and now it's sitting on the test stand and ready to fire up for the first time. There's a few things we had to do to kind of change things around just to make it work on the test stand. So I don't want to alarm anybody, but we had to take off that stock piece on here, the thermostat housing. It went way in the back like that. We had to go to this style so we can get to our radiator. Now this is a roller camshaft, so the braking procedure is not nearly as stringent, at least in my opinion, as it is with a flat type of camshaft. Yes, I like to run them for 20 minutes, but if I have to shut it off because it wants to get hot, it's not a big deal. And, but I usually run, 10 minutes, let's say, and kind of is what it is. And I guess let's see if it fires up. Now, over and under, unless they changed it, it should fire. We'll spin her a little bit without the coil on, so no ignition. Get a little bit of oil pressure going, and then that'll also help us get some fuel up to the bowls. I put some in the bowls with the primer bottle. Okay, there's our oil pressure. So here we go, ignition on, coil on, starter. I almost wonder if we flooded it. Do we have spark? We got spark. Not getting fuel to it yet. I want to trust that carburetor out of the box and then not kind of at the same time. It's doing exactly what I said initially. It's off 180. Right.
You just check that wrong.
Checking it wrong.
Which one did you check?
4. 5 over here, not 1. One's over there.
One's over there.
But I'm sitting here looking at it, one. This is gonna be good. All right, we're done with the fireballs. Here we go. Sounded way better. All right, well, you can see we got it running. It runs good, but I'm getting a little backfire out of it. And, well, I use the old stethoscope here, mechanic stethoscope. And remember when I told you those header gaskets suck? Sorry, they suck. Well, they're really sucking because now they're sucking air in because they were on the motor for about 2.2 seconds and they're already leaking. But anyway, we'll fix that when it goes in the car with the good gaskets, and I won't need my stethoscope anymore. So with that, a little bit of tuning, we'll run it in. And when I said I know I was a little weird on, well, how much I'm gonna break it in. Basically, I run a couple heat cycles on it. That's how I break in a roller cam. Again, bring up the RPM, all the splash, blah, 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 with oil. So anyhow, this one's done. It's a wrap until, of course, it goes into the car. So until then, get out in the shop, go get your work done. See ya.